This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 194 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we'll be sharing 3 easy ways to add culturally responsive critical thinking to the lessons you're already teaching, an approach called finding the funk. One major flaw in the way many schools are set up is that critical thinking is usually set aside just for advanced students. If you're in a class called honors or advanced, you'll be thinking about deep, complex questions and having thoughtful, engaging debates, while kids in the non-honors classes are stuck in an endless cycle of the basics, with a whole lot of sit and get instruction and repetitive drills. This sad reality is usually justified as follows. There's no time in lower level classes for critical thinking. Students still don't have the basics down, so it would make no sense to set aside time for extra critical thinking activities. My guest today, Colin Seale, would argue that this setup is doing kids a huge disservice, that this is fundamentally an equity issue, and I agree with him. If we truly believe in making education equitable for all students, and if we want to equip all of our students to become the kind of people who make positive contributions to their communities, then one change we need to make at the classroom level is to give all students regular practice in critical thinking, regardless of where they are on any academic scale. After laying out this argument in his new book, Tangible Equity, Seale offers a framework for providing more equitable pedagogy to all students. And an early step in that framework is something he calls finding the funk, a way of looking for places in our curriculum that make us stop and go, In this episode, he shares 3 strategies for finding the funk, ways you can infuse critical thinking into just about any lesson or unit without creating a whole new separate activity or taking up a lot of extra time. These are techniques you can try right away. And my guess is that as you listen, you'll be coming up with ideas you can plug into the things you're already doing. If Seale's name sounds familiar to you, it's because he's been a guest on my podcast before. Just last year in episode 168, when we talked about using mistake analysis as another critical thinking strategy. I really think both of Colin's books, Thinking Like a Lawyer and now Tangible Equity, and the work that he does with his team at Think Law are a vital part of the tools we need toward building equity in education. One more thing, math teachers will find this episode just as relevant to your teaching as those who teach any other subject area. I think the math teachers in my audience may sometimes get left out, but Colin is a former math teacher. So although the strategies he shares really do work with any subject area, he seems to lean toward math first, so you'll get a lot out of his approach. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Pear Deck for sponsoring this episode. The educators who created Pear Deck set out to transform technology into a tool that fosters personal connections and engagement in the classroom. And Pear Deck's seamless integration with Google Slides and Microsoft PowerPoint lets you do just that. By adding formative assessments, polls, and interactivity into your lessons, Pear Deck can help you generate 100% student engagement for learners of all ages and abilities, across every subject, every grade, every day. And here's some great news. Pear Deck is offering all of today's listeners 90 days of Pear Deck Premium access for free. Just visit peardeck.com/cultofpedagogy22 to get started. Support also comes from Coder Z, a gamified coding platform combining STEM, computer science, and critical life skills. With a standards-aligned award-winning curriculum, Coder Z eliminates fear through meaningful support and preparation of educators by implementing fun, flexible, and engaging instruction in a real-world context. Through the power of virtual robotics, students in 4th grade and beyond use computational thinking to overcome obstacles, show off their skills on a global scale, and embrace failures as a part of learning. With Coder Z, educators open pathways for students inspired and motivated to discover their future. Built for everyone from the tech nerd to the computer shy. Visit cultofpedagogy.com/coderz to bring coding to your classroom today. Now here's my conversation with Colin Seale about finding the funk. Colin, welcome back to the podcast.
Excited to be here, Jen.
So this is your second time. We talked a lot last time about mistake analysis, and for anybody who is new to the world of Colin Seale, tell me a little bit about what you do, and as it relates to education.
Sure. So I'm a math teacher who made the crazy decision to go to law school at night while teaching during the day. But it lit me on fire and got me to a point where I recognize there's so much power in an instructional model that's not just driven around just focusing on one exact answer, but really applying critical thinking to a lot of real world challenges that we experience on a day to day basis. So a lot of what we do is we help school systems embed culturally responsive critical thinking into your existing curriculum so it doesn't feel like one more thing. We model this to our curriculum that we have as a supplement that uses real life legal cases in upper grades, fairy tales, nursery rhymes, and folk tales in lower grades, because there's a lot of questionable characters in children's stories, and
Mm.
really giving teachers a lot of authentic ways to get kids to do this thing that we're talking about today, which is find that funk that really drives thought provoking inquiry in our classrooms on a day to day basis.
So let's talk about this word funk. And that is you've written a blog post for the site, and that is the first part of the title is finding the funk. What do you mean by funk?
So a lot of times when I think about funk, I think about like this idea, right? That the sort of thing that makes you change your facial expression. You know,
Hmm.
the kind of thing that makes you really go like, what? You get this emotional connection. It makes you think like, what? That's not right. Nah, nah, nah. That can't be true. That can't be okay. And it usually happens whenever we're talking about something that invokes something with conflict, controversy, surprise, drama. And sometimes when you say, hey, I taught middle school math, you will think like, I don't really get it. Where's the controversy? Where's the drama in middle school math? But if
Right.
we're thinking about it from a way of like, okay, I'm teaching circles, but when is a circle more than a circle? A circle is a set of
Mm.
all points equidistant from a single point. And that single point happens to be an elementary school in the lowest income area of your district. And we got to figure out how far we got to walk in each direction to find a healthy grocery store. That depiction of a circle through the concept of a food desert
Mm.
means something to me beyond just a circle, especially when I start comparing it to other circles in my community, where that circle might be neighborhoods that are more affluent or neighborhoods that have very different racial demographics. It's still circles, but I'm
Right.
exploring circles in a way that makes me actually see why a radius matters, why a circumference matters, why the area of a circle matters.
You're applying, in this case with the math anyway, you're applying the content to real life situations and allowing it to be a tool of critical thinking.
For sure. And I think part of the strategy here too is I know we're going to talk about my book Tangible Equity, but
Mhm.
it's just one of those things where the benefits of this are so much bigger than just what it means for instruction, what it means for deepening that connection and enhancing that learning outcome. It's what is it doing to a child who is regularly engaging in this type of exploration?
So let's do that before, because what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes are a couple of strategies that teachers can basically plug right into what they're already doing to find that funk and to add more critical thinking to what they're already doing. But let's rewind just a little bit. Let's talk about your new book. The last book was Think Like a Lawyer, and it was adding critical thinking to what we're already doing in school. So what's the angle of your new book, Tangible Equity? How is that different from Think Like a Lawyer?
It's a great question. So, yes, thinking like a lawyer was about strategies specifically focused on closing the critical thinking gap, right? Like, how do we
Mhm.
figure out a way to teach critical thinking to all kids? Tangible equity was birthed out of like a bigger picture. So, here I am, and it's 2020, and we've got this reckoning around racial justice in the United States, and we're working with schools across 40 states. And a lot of my school partners are like, "Hey, Colin, I really want you to come to my district and do an equity training." I'm like, "Well, that's not really what we do. It's not really what we do. It's not even what I want to start to do. But what I wanted to think about was like, you know what? At the end of the day, there's work that might be happening at the same time. We could walk and chew gum at the same time. Like
Mhm.
maybe you need to have courageous conversations about race, but if those courageous conversations are not leading to actual action, actual practical outcomes at the classroom level, then I don't know how courageous they actually are. So I started to really obsess with this idea of what would it look like to see equity at the classroom level? What would that actually entail? And what would it look like to get to a different place? Because, Jen, I'm the child of immigrants. My father was incarcerated for a decade for selling drugs. I grew up in this struggle. I'm a poster child of the kid who typically does not make it in our education system. But
Mm.
what really frustrates me is this model that, like, my grandmother, my mom, myself all grew up with this idea that we got to work twice as hard to get half as far.
Yeah.
And I have two children. Rose is 9, Oliver is 6, and I don't want to teach them that lesson. What does that mean? It means that we have to go beyond looking at the world as it is and giving our kids the tools that they need to imagine a world as it ought to be, which means they've got to be able to lead, to innovate, to break what needs to be broken. So how can we do that instructionally? How can we
Mm.
create these everyday opportunities for our students to be able to be the change makers, not just problem solvers, but problem finders? And that's really what the biggest focus is of this book. We help you think about this in the bigger picture of what it takes to create a space where kids can be disruptive on purpose, disruptive with a purpose.
It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like this applies to kids who have been historically marginalized in terms of empowering them, but it also sounds like it would put the same tools in the hands of kids who want to correct that marginalization, who want to be working toward equity for their peers and with their peers, alongside their peers. This is not maybe just about creating or correcting an imbalance within the classroom, but allowing all of the students to correct those imbalances everywhere.
For sure. And I mean, one of the first chapters in the book really asks this question about, like, equity for what? Right? We can talk about equity all day, but, like, equity for what? And
Mm.
you think about that diagram that's always out there about those little kids watching a baseball game, and some kids, they can't see over the fence. But then
Mhm.
with the right amount of crates, so if I get the smallest person the most crates and distribute that equitably, that everyone gets access. Like, yeah, equity. But I'm like, okay, what is the equity for? To watch a baseball game from outside of the stands? That's the equity? We're
Mm.
outside, everyone else is inside, and I might even not want to watch baseball. And this is the thing, like, the things we fight for sometimes make me scratch my head. When I grew up in New York, I got into the Bronx High School of Science, one of the specialized high schools you got to take a test to get into, where there are fewer black kids there today than they were when I attended. But again,
Mm.
are we really going to fight for equity so that kids like me have the ability to commute 90 minutes each way to go to school? Is that what we're fighting for equity for? Or should I have a high school that I can walk to that will give me a transformational educational experience?
Mm.
So what
Mhm.
it does is it really helps to kind of, like, hone our tools, hone our skills for more. And one of the most important parts about this, and I'm sure you've heard this a lot in your work too, how often do educators, no matter what their role is, give you some version of, well, I'm just a teacher.
Mm.
I'm just a teacher.
Mhm.
That issue over there, that's above my pay grade. So if this book does nothing else, it reminds you that you have power. You have so much power. You make hundreds of decisions every single week, and I need you to understand that power. And what happens when you use your power, if you prioritize things within your scope of concern, within your scope of authority, to really be able to make transformational change. So this is really the difference. It's really a power manual. And I want to be very careful, very intentional, that we're not using the word empower, because you already have it. We're not trying to empower students. They already have it. We're giving you an outlet. We're giving you a mirror so you can actually, like, look at your reflection and see that you have that power on a regular
Mm.
basis.
Mhm. One of the things that you mention in the book is about how in the lower levels, in terms of like your sort of average student versus a gifted class. The gifted kids are often the ones who get all the opportunities for the good, deep critical thinking, while the kids in the lower levels are just constantly churning out the drilling and just trying to get the basics. And it's one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that these are techniques that can be used in all sort of levels of ability in the classroom. It does not have to be, or it should not be, reserved just for those gifted classes.
Yes. And I got an expert trainer on my team, Clint Von Gundy, and Clint loves to use this phrase, performative equity, right? Because
Mm.
sometimes we can see this thing with gifted and we're like, okay, you know what? Let's eliminate gifted ed in the name of equity, right? But if we're really being serious about the world as it is, we'll recognize that parents with means will always be able to find those compelling advanced academic opportunities for their kids, right? But if we're going to have these things happening in our public schools, like that's going to be the only avenue that some of our other kids would have access to it. So my
Mm.
thing is, instead of saying, let's eliminate gifted ed, real equity would say, what if we did a better job of leveraging those strategies in my gen ed classroom as
Yes.
a part and parcel of tier one instruction. So if my tier one instruction was designed so that, it was really tailored to getting into that thought provoking instance, using this idea of a low floor, high ceiling model where I can meet you where you are cognitively to get you where you need to be academically. Could we do
Mm.
so much of let me meet you where you are academically? And
Mm.
honestly, I don't want to meet you where you are. You're in sixth grade and you're performing in third grade. I'm not going to third grade. I refuse. I'm a middle school teacher. I'm not doing it. But I'm going to give you the tools you need to rock it out in sixth grade. That's the difference.
Yeah. And that's we should mention this, even though we're not going to get into this, because you mentioned the low floor, high ceiling structure, and that really is sort of the bulk of your book is explaining to teachers how they can do this, how they can take any student and really help them to stretch regardless of where they're coming in at in terms of skill level. And this finding the funk is a piece of that. It's the one of the early steps of that, but there's
It
a lot
really
more
is.
to it. And if teachers are intrigued by this, they should go and get the whole book.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure. And finding the funk is really where it starts because think about it, right? Just from a very like practical level. How are you going to have students who, whether it's due to the pandemic or whatever, are like struggling academically? Maybe they're not all that engaged in what's going on right now. Maybe you're experiencing all kinds of behavior challenges, whatever. How could the plan be, you know what we really got to do? More drill and kill, more
Mm.
rote memorization, more review. No, you got to jack them up. You got to
Yeah.
get them being like, wait, huh? That don't make any sense. What are you talking about? That's what we got to go for. I'll give you a concrete example, okay?
Hmm.
I'm in Denver, Colorado, and I'm in a pre-calculus class from a first-year teacher. And I'm walking around and they're doing function composition. For those of y'all that were traumatized by math, I apologize. But it's f of g of x and g of f of x. So I'm like plugging things into these alternative functions in a way that always confuses kids. But I'm
Yeah.
walking around and every kid is doing it correctly. I'm like, what did this guy do? I'm looking at the board. I don't see any like really compelling algorithms. What did he do? He started the lesson with the most controversial topic imaginable. More controversial than abortion, immigration, the most ridiculous thing ever. It could divide families. Whether or not it's okay to put pineapple on pizza. Oh my goodness. That's how we started class. Whether it was okay to put pineapple on pizza. Kids got all revved up. And then he asked them to imagine what it would look like to put pizza on a pineapple. And that visualization, for whatever reason, did so much magic for kids to be able to understand f of g of x means that I'm plugging that g of x into it, getting the result, and then plugging that into the f. And then I do the same thing the other way when it comes to g of f of x. And I'm like, brilliance.
Hmm.
But it started with the funk. It
Right.
started with the funk, right? So that's why we start with this topic of finding the funk.
Okay. Okay. So that's what we're going to talk about. You've got three easy to implement strategies that teachers can plug into what they're already doing. So let's hear them.
So first one we talk about is looking at rule making. And that might sound like, oh, rule making, like they're students, they're kids. But like a lot of times when we're asking ourselves to make sense of something,
Hmm.
we're really trying to like create a rule in my head of how this goes, right? Like as lawyers, when I was practicing law, it'll be like, all right, it's not whether my client can win this case. It's whether or not like there's a rule that I can sort of articulate that makes it clear as to why my client should win this case. So if I'm thinking about what this means, if I think about like how I can get to a point where I can get there, I think it seems simple that I can do this in math class, right? Like I can see a pattern and there's a rule for a pattern. That's like a concrete way that I'm making a rule. Like, why is this pattern existing? But if I start thinking about this a little bit differently, if I start looking at it like, okay, I got these 3 paragraphs. One doesn't have all that great grammar. The other paragraph has not that great organization. The third paragraph is technically perfect, but didn't answer the question. Which one should get a higher grade on the rubric? So maybe there's a part of this where I'm creating a kind of a rubric where I realize, like, okay, like in my rubric, I'm going to make like the actual content count for more than I would count the grammar, the organization or whatever. But like there's something involved that happens when my kids start thinking like an English teacher, start thinking like a writing teacher, right? If I'm thinking about rule making, maybe I'm a music appreciation teacher and my kids are trying to like know the difference between Baroque and Romantic periods of music. So the question is whether that Old Town Road song by Lil Nas X is a country song. What makes a country song country? What makes a country song country? Because they're talking about like country stuff. Are they doing country things? Because Old Town Road talks about country stuff and doing country things. So what makes it that way? Having a guitar in it, having drums. Old Town Road has a guitar and drums in it. And the thing is, it's about me using who I am to help be a part of this rule. Right? I'll give you a more concrete instructional example. Suppose we're looking at a U.S. history thing, and I'm trying to ask, I'm actually asking you a question here, Jen. We're trying to figure out what's the most significant date and person of the Revolutionary War. What's the most significant date? Who's the most significant person in the Revolutionary War? Tell me why a student who might have memorized every detail about the Revolutionary War might still struggle with that question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why might they still struggle with the question of what's the most significant date? Who's the most significant person?
They haven't thought about any of the implications. They just know all the stuff lined up like it's all even, but they haven't had an opportunity to really develop an opinion about it.
And the thing that's really interesting about this is the facts clear, significance funky. So how do we get this here? How do we get to this point where we get to this rule making being a part of it? I might ask you, who is the most significant person in your household? Who is the most significant person in your school? And when I start thinking about these things, and I'm like, you know what? There's an argument that it could be my principal, my teacher, but actually my best friend is the most significant person in my school because I wouldn't even come to school if my best friend wasn't coming to school. So there's this idea that I can own significance using my story, my identity, my experiences, my education in school, my education out of school, and tell me what is more culturally responsive to making this whole thing be about me. I was in Grace James Middle School, which is in Jefferson County, Louisville, Kentucky. And I saw a teacher start off a lesson where she was having kids do this thing about looking at an author from China from the year 600. And it was a woman talking about like the need to think about traditional rights for women being updated, right? Fighting for women's rights in China in the year 600. It's not that interesting. It's not that compelling. But do you know how the teacher started the lesson? Is tradition good or bad? Explain. And what she's doing is not asking, is tradition good or bad? She's asking, is your traditions good or bad? What do you think about your traditions? What traditions do you think are good? What traditions do you think are bad? And what it does is it helps us figure out this kind of idea of now I have a rule for when it is the case that traditions ought to be updated. That traditions ought to be kind of like pushed to the side in favor of something that's more modern, more new. But what is that? That is a curriculum for breaking stuff that needs to be broken.
Yeah.
That is the pathway to make my mind up to be a change maker.
With something like this, so the examples that you have given me, I think they've all come at the beginning of a lesson. So is that typically when this works best to sort of launch a lesson with these questions and make space for a conversation?
It can work at the beginning of a lesson. It can be a really thought-provoking way to think about like how we can get just beyond an objective of just mere kind of knowing stuff and much more towards like being able to evaluate and synthesize stuff. But I get to a point where I also say, you know, it works really well at the end of it as well, right? At the end of it as well, because I can finish a unit on the systems of equations and algebra, and it can be like, all right, well, what's actually the best way to solve system of equations? In fact, when would we want to use each method? Like, what's the best rule for when we should use each method? And I can start to think that solve a system of equations by graphing makes sense when the functions that are being poured into them are very simple graphs with really clear and easy to identify intersections. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I might want to do something by elimination when it's really clear that without a lot of manipulation, some of the variables will cancel each other out. Maybe I want to do it by substitution when it's really clear that it'll be very easy to plug one in because the values aren't complex, the equations aren't super long, but I get to set up those rules. I've got the power to make those
Right.
rules. So that's kind of like the flexibility that I have there. But most of the time when I see teachers doing a rulemaking, it's something that they think about as like, the objective for a lesson. Like if I'm trying to look at rocks in earth science, metamorphic, sedimentary, igneous, it might be easier and more compelling to have my kids look at rocks over time and like make the rule for what makes a metamorphic rock
Mm-hmm.
based off of their
Mm-hmm.
observations and
Right.
their thinking like a scientist.
It sounds like it could also be, I mean, a question that you start a unit with, but you keep returning to it as more information comes up.
Yes,
Yeah.
because that's what rules do, right? And what does
Right.
that do, Jen? It helps us realize that, like, hey, you know what? Some things need to adapt over time. They
Mm-hmm.
need to adapt over time. Like, I thought it was so interesting in physics in high school, every question presumes a frictionless surface. But there are no frictionless surfaces, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like, there's a level of looking at physics that requires me going to this deeper level. Why not have my kids imagine what if we didn't presume frictionless surfaces?
Hmm.
Right? Like, why we have to make these assumptions? And
Right.
it really helps me understand how these things all play into one
Yeah.
another.
So the first one was making rule making. What is the second strategy?
So this one, I'm going to warn you. This could be one of the most funky ones for the educator. Okay, because this is
Okay.
about breaking and shaking the rules. It's
Okay.
about getting to a point where, like, we're really going to be exploring a lot of funk into this piece. So
Mhm.
I'll give you kind of just insight into why this can feel so funky. If I'm trying to help a student on a problem, right, and they're struggling on something, let's say that they're struggling to read the word incomplete. I cannot
Mhm.
read that word incomplete. I'm like and I'm like, hey, Miss G, can I get some help on this? And maybe we're like, okay, well, sound it out. Okay, what's the first sound? Okay, in. So next one. Okay, so I sounded it out. I broke it out, and that's better than just giving me the word sometimes, right? But what if instead we ask that kid, well, what questions should you be asking yourself right now? So I'm not telling you the word. I'm saying, hey, what questions should you be asking yourself right now? Because maybe I already know these rules. Maybe I need to find a way to kind of look at it for me like, all right, I can own this process of like getting into it so I can sort of persevere through the problem solving process without somebody on my shoulder constantly giving me that next
Right.
probing question. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking and shaking the rules helps me get to this point. Helps me get to this point because what happens now is I start to accept things might not always be done in the best way. Breaking and shaking the rules can be like, all right, I'm not going to teach you the periodic table of elements. I'm a chemistry teacher, and we're going to go through part one. We're going to give you a list of elements, and I'm going to ask you to think through in this list of elements and whatever, how they ought to be sorted. Because maybe you have some interesting ideas of how you would sort all these different elements based off of
Mm-hmm.
their mass or the number of electrons or whatever have you. But if I look at the way it's actually organized, is there a way for me to do it that's more intuitive? Are there
Mm-hmm.
arguments for my group's class being a little bit of a better way to organize this periodic table of elements
Mm-hmm.
than the way that they have it now? I think there's a really, really powerful case to say, why don't we have it organized in terms of the alphabetical order of what it's actually called rather than the symbol, because it can be less confusing and more accessible to folks. And these are the kinds of things that help me think like, all right, like, what is science if not something that helps us explain the world around us?
Mm-hmm.
I believe there's a better way to explain it to my community, to my classroom. So that's breaking and shaking it, right? Sometimes breaking and shaking means we've got to be able to look at rules that no longer work. Something that we thought was going to be okay, but it no longer works. We have a lot of people that use think loss curriculum in the summer. And one of the things we have for our summer lessons, as well as for the lessons we do for families at home, because we have our own portal for families at home called Raising Critical Thinkers, is we give them really small, like jury deliberations kinds of things, like a 15-minute exercise. Works really well for like a warm up or a do now, just to kind of get our kids thinking in this way. But like Six Flags had these unlimited meal plans that made a whole lot of sense until ridiculous people on TikTok took it to the extreme. And they took like all you can eat and unlimited to mean I'm gonna have every meal here every day and eat like a crazy person. And all of a sudden, we got to think about how we might have to like look at this rule a little bit differently. Okay.
Right.
The rule has got shaken up. How do we adjust? What do we do to change this up? Okay. And when kids start to own their status, that, Chen, it took me like 15 years to realize this. I am the system. I can't keep on blaming the system, right? I am the system. Like, it's the politics. Politics involve people. I am a person. So I am politics. If I'm getting into this mindset where breaking and shaking the rules becomes normalized, then
Yeah.
it's so much easier for me to see myself doing this in the broader society.
Yeah, I mean, this is where my mind is going listening to. I'm thinking if they're looking at academic rules, the next step in their mind is like looking at just regular rules that we have right now that guide the way. And that's the whole legislative process, is somebody saying that doesn't make sense, let's change it to this. And then they go through the whole process of, and once a kid understands that this is sort of how the world works, whether it's legislatively or even just in the workplace, they say this system isn't working, we need to change it. They start to see maybe their own agency.
For sure. And I think the thing about breaking and shaking the rules is really powerful. Is for a lot of our kids, I think this is really the only way. It's really the only way, which is a deep dive into who I am and how I am and leverage that to really be able to get the most that I can out of this world. When I first started Think Law, a very close mentor of mine in education, an elder Black woman who I respected and admired, said, Colin, this stuff is great. Curriculum was awesome. But I had to just tell you, you can't do this. Why can't I do this? Well, you're just a teacher. You've never been an admin. You don't have your PhD in curriculum and instruction. You haven't done this. You haven't done this. And all I heard in my mind is, that's it. I'm just a teacher. That's it. That is going to be everything I talk about all the time, because all I know is that perspective of being overwhelmed and under-resourced and not having enough time to do the things I really, really want to do. So I'm going to lean into that to 1,000% of being my identity in this work, period. And the thing is, I don't want to follow that path. I don't need to follow those rules. I can do a different way. It has to be broken. It has to be shaken up. And this is kind of like the question that I really want listeners to think about, right? How many times throughout history have extremely terrible things happened by people who were just following orders?
Ugh.
How many times? And I would be lying to you if I didn't make some super painful mistakes in my life as an educator because I just was following policy. I just was following orders. And those things haunt me. But you have power. You have power to use who you are to say, you know what? I am going to use this as a moment to break stuff. So much easier, though, if you're doing that from the time you're in kindergarten.
What's the third strategy?
So it's actually one of my favorites, because essentially the most, the least, the best, or worst, it takes me all the way back to the idea that I knew everything I needed to know about logos and pathos and ethos and persuasion by growing up in the Black barbershop in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, right? Like, and everything was always like, who's the most best player? Who's the prettiest person in movies? And all these arguments, all these things were like super subjective. But if you think about it, every novel has a chance for me to rank who's the most shadiest character in this.
Yeah.
Who's the most innocent? Who's the most responsible? And if I start looking at this idea of like, ranking significance, thinking about this idea that like, I have a gut feeling. I've got something in my heart that tells me I'm really leaning towards this person, though. It really makes more sense to do this problem this way. It gets to a point where I start to recognize my insight is valid. My take on this is valid. It's not just some random gut feeling. It's informed by a lot of different things. And my perspective really matters. I'll give you a very concrete question about this, right? I was in a middle school classroom, and they were doing a case that was extending this idea of battery, where like there was racial bias involved. somebody like hurt somebody physically because of their race. And the teacher asked the question, what's worse? Throwing a stick at somebody because of their identity as an Asian person, or throwing a stick at somebody because they had on a purple shirt? And everyone was like, Asian will be much worse. That's racist. That's racism. Racism isn't okay. You can't control how you're born. That's just messed up. But then one little girl, neurodivergent to the max, raises her hand and says, purple shirt, far worse. All right? I'm not disregarding that. I'm asking you to explain and justify. Well, why would you say that? She's like, well, unfortunately, we know that racism is real. We know that racism exists. But if you are throwing a stick at somebody because they're wearing purple, you might have much more serious issues. And it's like, all right, valid point. Well taken. But we create a space for these different kinds of perspectives when we do these kinds of rankings. And you know what I like about rankings the most? I have a friend who's a military commander in the Air Force. And he's like, we don't have a textbook where we're going to be able to do great decisions all the time in the real world when things are actually happening. Sometimes we got to choose between things that are not always the best options. But that's how you build judgment.
Right.
Okay, none of these are great, but which one of these would be best given the circumstances? So even with standardized test prep, and a lot of times when we think about finding the funk and critical thinking and the kind of things that we need to be able to do tangible equity, we don't necessarily think standardized tests. But I say, hey, you know what? If you want to really create a pathway where we can interrupt intergenerational poverty, we got to be able to make sure our kids can pass the test to be a lawyer, to be a doctor, to be an engineer. Even plumbers got to pass tests, right? So the thing about these is, imagine I'm starting out my class once a week with a question that doesn't just ask me to pick the right multiple choice answer, but asks me to say, what's the most wrong answer? What's the best wrong answer? Right? The most one would be, the most further off from what the correct answer should be. The best one would be the one that's most likely to trip up other kids in my classroom, right? So if it's a main idea question, maybe that first sentence, using that as a choice, which is not the main idea, could really throw a lot of kids off. So it'll be the best one. So now we're at a point where our kids are learning not just how to play the game, but they're getting that extra deep level metacognition, that funk that allows them to be able to slay the game. And that's what we're able to do once you start getting into that ranking component of finding the funk.
I'm imagining teachers using more of this approach that you're talking about. And I'm thinking about those moments you have as a teacher where things are going so well that the bell rings and nobody wants to leave. And that sounds like the kind of conversations and discussions that these strategies would generate, where kids are just like, no, let us stay. We don't need to go to lunch. We want to keep talking about this. And that's magic. And that's dopamine that you're getting from school, where so many kids now are just drained and uninspired. And so not only are we giving them the agency to understand how they can start to look critically and make change, but just making school a more energizing place to be.
Right. Because why am I going to be causing cause of drama and ridiculousness on Snap and on TikTok between my peers when the teacher's not looking, when I could do that in class? When in class, I now have a chance to act the fool and be ridiculous. This is the point. And the thing is, we laugh about this, right? But we always had this thing where, we have education as a whole, but then we know that we have kids that have always been in every single classroom a little bit harder to reach, a little bit harder to connect with, right? And when kids like me have a space where within the regular scheduled programming of academic content, I have multiple opportunities to use who I am and how I am, to use my disruptive tendencies for good, to use my defiant tendencies for good, to get to a point where I shouldn't have to wait until law school to be a good student. I was always considered an underachiever. I was never student of the month, but I graduated top of my law school class. We shouldn't have to wait for these kinds of environments to have those kids who go against the grain and march to the beat of their own drummer be valued.
Yeah. So the book is Tangible Equity. I'm going to read out the full title. Tangible Equity, a guide for leveraging student identity, culture, and power to unlock excellence in and beyond the classroom. And in your post, we are going to link to that so people can find that and Thinking Like a Lawyer. I want more teachers to discover what you're doing, because it's like, it's not even something they have to take a whole course on, or, they can try some of this stuff right away. And that's exactly the kind of thing that teachers need.
And the exciting part about this is, even when we dig in deeper with districts and do PD, whatever, we have learned to just focus on this one right here. If we can get you finding the funk, if we could spend hours, days on finding the funk, this impulse right here is the start of everything else. So many things flow from this. If this becomes a habit, when this becomes second nature, so many things start to change, because now student says something in class and you feel it. This is a moment where I can gotta get there and go and do something with. But that's something that comes through muscle memory. So that's what we do by really focusing in on this when we do that. So so excited for a chance to talk about the work with tangible equity and to give you all some practical tools that you can use. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Colin. I appreciate it.
For sure, always.
To read Colin's blog post describing these strategies and find a link to both of his books, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 194. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.